campus.
And are you a native Philadelphian?
I grew up in South Jersey, so I'm just pretending.
Me too. I'm from California, so I'm really pretending.
Where in California?
I'm from Los Angeles, from the San Fernando Valley.
Oh, so cool. How'd you get out here?
My wife is from Philadelphia.
Okay.
So apparently when you marry someone from Philadelphia, you're doomed to move to Philadelphia.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So I'm going to give you a little introduction. Excuse my voice. I'll give you a little introduction when I actually go to post the thing. And I'll send it to you. I probably have about 8 family members who just feel guilty enough to listen to the podcast. So you don't have to worry about it. It's easier to send through Spotify, so I'll just send it to you. And if you have any, for whatever reason, want to take it down, I'll take it down as soon as you say. But I won't send it to anybody until I get the okay from you, if that's all right.
That's good. I mean, I don't like hearing my own voice, so I may not listen to it. But I'm happy to have a conversation with you. Great. I appreciate it.
Yeah, perfect. And like I said, I'll give you a little introduction, but I guess I'd be really curious just to hear you say what you do. And I could read the titles on the Penn website, but I'm not exactly sure what all of them mean. So maybe whatever your highlights of your own job title is.
So I am a scholar of religious studies and Jewish studies. I began my career focused on the study of the ancient Jewish world, which includes the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, but also the Jewish culture that developed in the centuries after the Bible, the period of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the period that produced Christianity as well as Judaism as we know it today. And I'm interested in also the kind of history of how the Bible has kind of shaped the way people think and how they express themselves in literature, and how the Bible's influenced culture. So I'm interested in kind of the afterlife of the Bible. So that's the kind of core of my interest. I also direct a center for the study of Jewish experience and Jewish history and culture called the Cat Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. So part of my life is kind of administrative, and part of it is scholarly, and part of it is teaching.
Very cool. Just to maybe contextualize all of my questions, and I think I said this in the email, I'm coming from a what I might argue later is like sort of a culturally Catholic background, and I teach in a Catholic school currently. But I've become really recently interested, in sort of the origins of religions in general, but first the one that I was closest to. And I found that the more that I got into the origin of Christianity and Catholicism, I was just reading the Old Testament. And I talked to a few different people, but I'm interested in sort of digging deeper and deeper into that. So I guess to start us off, I was teaching a class, and I teach one section, an off section of English. And there was some Christian allusion. And I was asking a question. There was this kid in class who normally wouldn't say anything, and if he did, he would be taking a risk, and I'd have to be really careful about how I told him he was wrong and that kind of thing. And he sort of shouted out, it's like a church history question, and he shouted out the Council of Nicaea. And it was kind of this hilarious joke when I realized that it definitely wasn't right. But I was like, how does he know what that is? And I was like, oh, that must be the one answer he knows to be often right in his church history class. and I sort of was talking to him about it later, and I was like, yeah, right. It's probably right most of the time in his other class. And I found out recently that there was a Council of Jamnia, and I never heard of this. So I sometimes look at the Council of Nicaea as something that would have in part determined the canonical texts of the Christian tradition. Is it the Council of Jamnia that determines some of the canonical texts of the Hebrew Bible? Am I understanding that correctly?
So that was once a view, but what people realize, what scholars realize, is that the way a lot of the scholars that were studying ancient Judaism were Christian, and what was happening was that they were taking what they knew about Christian history and kind of projecting it on the Jewish history.
And
so the
and
whole
I'm in that
idea
tradition.
that, yeah, I mean, we all do that. We all take what we're familiar with and project it onto things that we're less familiar with. And so the whole idea that there were these like major decisions about what was in the Bible, or what is the proper thing to believe, that these were made by councils on the model of what we think of kind of the formative age of kind of Christian doctrine. That's kind of projecting Christian history onto Jewish history, and it didn't really work that way.
Interesting.
So there wasn't really. That's not how the Hebrew Bible came to be. It wasn't a decision of a body of experts. It got a longer history than that. And the story of the New Testament and how there became to be a Christian Bible is a different story than the story of how there came to be a Jewish Bible.
Sure. So I guess that might have answered my question, but is the Council of Jamnia as decisive, or is there any parallel there? What did it decide?
No. So well, it's hard to answer that question. It's a really good question because it's a hard question. So we know it wasn't decided by a council of rabbis. There was a few debates about a few books. There's a few books in the Bible that were puzzling to the kind of the rabbis. One of them is the book of Ecclesiastes,
sure,
or Kohelet Hebrew. And if you read that book, it's like very different from the other books in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, whoever wrote that book is questioning things that other biblical books take for granted as part of their understanding of God. And there's a few other books like that where there are things in it that are surprising, and you can't figure out why did this book get into the Bible. So, there was some debate about the rabbis about those kind of books, but the core of the Hebrew Bible was formed much earlier. And, the core of it, which is the 5 books of Moses, what Jews refer to as the Torah, it was, we don't even know exactly how it became part of the Bible, but it was hundreds of years before the rabbis, before the Council of Jamnia, before all that. So it's kind of a longer story, and it's not the same kind of story as for the New Testament.
Interesting. Do you have your own instincts about how something like Ecclesiastes ended up in the Old Testament or in the Hebrew Bible? Excuse me.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's actually asked me that question before. So, I mean, I know a little bit of the process. So, everything that made it into the Bible, into the Jewish Bible, it had to meet some criteria. One of those criteria is it had to be revealed through a prophet. So,
okay.
But a lot of the biblical books, some of them identify the prophet, but some of them don't. So Ecclesiastes made it in because it was attributed to King Solomon. And King Solomon, I don't think he was the actual author, but it was attributed to him, along with the book of Proverbs and the book of Song of Songs. And the Song of Songs, by the way, is another surprising, puzzling book, because if you read it without preconceptions, it's a very erotic love song. Like, what is this doing in the Hebrew Bible? But it was attributed to King Solomon, and Jews and then later Christians as well came to read it as an allegory. They read it not literally, but they read it as a kind of symbol of God's love for Israel, or God's love for the church. So those 3 books, Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, Song of Songs, were attributed to King Solomon, who was considered one of these prophets of the Hebrew Bible. King David was credited with the book of Psalms. The books of Samuel were attributed to the prophet Samuel. So every book in the Hebrew Bible has to be attached to some prophet.
I didn't know that. Does Ecclesiastes stand out in the canon of the Hebrew Bible for being decided to not be read literally? Are the other books read literally by default, or is it taken book by book?
So the book I was referring to that was read allegorically or symbolically is the Song of Songs.
Okay, sorry.
And well, here's the thing, and this is true of Christianity as well as in Judaism. There's like many different ways to read these books.
Sure.
So Christians really developed what we call allegorical interpretation. So allegorical interpretation is where you basically believe the Bible has kind of two levels of meaning. The kind of surface literal meaning and a deeper symbolic meaning. And there were Jews who read the Bible that way, but Christians really picked up on that and really, really developed it. People like Origen, a 3rd century Christian scholar and interpreter, really developed allegorical interpretation. So Jews today don't really read the Bible allegorically, but they have other ways of reading it that I don't think you or I would call literal. Because I don't know what you mean by that term, but what I mean when I hear the word literal, I mean somebody's trying to like just read it word for word, take it on face value, not try to add to the text or import ideas into the text, but just try to take the text on its own terms. Jews don't read it that way, not in the way that you or I might think of literal. So they have their own way of reading that's called midrash, which is a kind of a style of interpretation that was developed by ancient rabbis, and that it takes a little bit of explaining to get used to that, but that's different from allegory. Christians developed another kind of interpretation called typology, which we can talk about if you're interested. And so there's no kind of one way to read the Bible in either community.
Yeah, I'm fascinated. What is typology, and what was the I didn't hear the type that the ancient rabbis.
That's the word midrash, which is spelled midrash. It's a Hebrew word. It comes from a word that means kind of investigate. And if you want to understand how Jews today understand the Bible, you first of all need to know they don't read it literally.
Okay.
They read it through this technique called midrash, which is a very creative, interesting mode of interpretation that really kind of takes little hints in the Bible and really kind of squeezes them for everything they mean. Squeezes the little details for everything they mean. And Jews do, it depends on what you mean by literal, but an observant Jew is trying to follow the laws that are in the Hebrew Bible. But those laws that are in the Hebrew Bible and in the 5 books of Moses are being understood through midrash, through this kind of interpretive technique. So I don't know if you've ever had a chance to talk to anybody about keeping kosher, but keeping kosher, there's kind of special dietary rules. Some of them come from the Bible, but a lot of them do not. Keeping kosher, for example, you would not eat a cheeseburger, and there's nothing about cheeseburgers in the 5 books of Moses. I can promise you that. There's nothing about pepperoni pizza. There's a lot of things that are part of keeping kosher that come through the way the rabbis interpreted the Bible, as opposed to just coming straight out of the Bible. So that's midrash. Typology. And by the way, I'm sorry if I'm going on too long.
No, this is great. I'm sorry, typology, the lighting keeps changing there.
Oh, no problem. No, I don't. That's fine. Typology is a mode of interpretation developed by Christians that connects the Old Testament to the New Testament. And basically, the idea is to read the Old Testament as a foreshadowing of the New Testament, and to look for details in the Hebrew Bible, especially the 5 books of Moses, that kind of correspond to the life of Jesus, or the crucifixion, the death of Jesus. So, reading, for example, the story of Cain and Abel, where Cain, these 2 brothers, they were the sons of Adam and Eve, and Cain murders Abel. And one typological reading that early Christians developed was that Abel was a kind of anticipation or foreshadowing of Christ, who was also killed. So kind of looking for clues in the 5 books of Moses or other biblical books that are where you can read them as kind of a foreshadowing or kind of a preview of what's going to happen in the New Testament. So that's another kind of Christian interpretation that develops very early on, and that becomes very important for how Christians understand the Bible.
Yeah, and I'm not a New Testament scholar, but I would imagine some people might argue that some of the New Testament, if not much of it, was written that way, as if to refer back.
That's absolutely true. So if you read the Gospels, if you read the Gospel of John,
Yeah,
and you read about John's, Jesus' miracles, some of the miracles are similar to the miracles that Moses does. And so you're right that the author of that, the way he understood Jesus, he saw him as kind of a second Moses. So that's true. But typology came later, and it's the idea that the prophets that wrote the Hebrew Bible, God revealed to them a kind of glimpse of what was going to come.
interesting.
And they kind of encoded that into what they wrote and gave kind of hints that Christians can recognize and draw the 2 testaments together that way.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I've probably 7 or 8 different strings I want to pull on here,
Sure.
so I might meander back successfully or not. That this question of typology brings up for me this idea, or I start to wonder: is there a difference between theologians who are scholars and scholars who aren't um, religiously motivated at all, and might not have any problem saying, the author of this book was a little heavy-handed referring to this, and almost seems like they might have been compensating for something? Where the
Another great, yeah.
Sorry, yeah, maybe just to punctuate that question, whereas the early Christian scholarship seems like it's going to clearly be theological, if that isn't obvious, where people who might be doing scholarship today might be more interested in um, not trying to be systematically theological, if that makes any sense.
It does make sense, and it's a really important issue to bring up. So today, kind of working backward from today, you have scholars that are coming from within a religious community who believe the Bible is the Word of God, believe in God, believe that the Bible is the Word of God, and who are using scholarship to understand what God was trying to communicate through the Bible. So you have a lot of scholars like that. Probably the majority of scholars are like that. But then you have another group of scholars, and these scholars you find these scholars at places like Penn and secular universities that, they may be religious in their personal life, but as scholars, they are taking the methods that scholars use to study Shakespeare, or scholars use to study Homer, or scholars use to study any text. They're just taking those methods and applying them to the Bible, essentially treating the Bible as a humanly authored document written by human beings who lived in a particular time and place, and saying, we want to understand what those authors are trying to say. So in order to do that, we need to kind of put them in their environment that they were writing in, and that means studying the ancient languages and learning about the history, and basically approaching the Bible in the way you would approach any humanly authored document. So that is the method. That's the approach I was trained in. That's my orientation, but that doesn't mean I'm anti-religious. It doesn't mean that I'm not respectful of people who read the Bible from a religious perspective. I want to understand how those people understand the text. My wife is a rabbi. She's a leader in the religious community. So it's not like they're necessarily at odds with each other, but they do have these different approaches that they
Interesting.
bring to the table.
Should it not surprise me that so many are in the former category that you described? I would imagine that seems problematic, that the majority of scholars, that we depend on the minority of scholars to be, for lack of a better word, objective.
So, it's worth bearing in mind that 80% of the world's population still identifies as religious. So there's a big 20% is a big minority that identifies as secular.
Sure.
But 80% still identify, there's, I think 2 billion Christians in the world, there's 1 billion Muslims in the world. That's roughly half of the population right there, just those two religious communities. So, because the majority of the world's population still identifies as religious, the majority of people who care about the Bible enough to study it are also coming from a religious perspective. And, there's a lot of people who are secular too, but, they're concentrated in Western Europe and the United States. But the Bible is important in Africa. The Bible is important in Latin America. The Bible is important, to a lot of religious Christians in America. So, just by sheer demographics, they're the majority. But the secular approach is very consequential. Basically, the secular world that we know today, now people are, have different opinions about whether the secular world is good or bad. But whether it's good or bad, the secular world as we know it today depends in part on scholars about 300 years ago beginning to question religious beliefs about the Bible. And beginning to question, hey, why do we believe this text comes from God? Why do we think this comes from Moses? Is it because the text itself says it comes from Moses? No, it actually never says that it comes from Moses. That's a tradition that we were taught by our, religious authorities, and maybe they're just human beings like we are, and maybe we can question what they say. And that's what began to happen in the 17th century, and that laid the groundwork, the theological, intellectual groundwork for the emergence of the secular world, which is basically, secularism is basically thinking outside of religion, not thinking within a religious framework. That's about 300 years old, and it began with people challenging the traditional view of the Bible.
Fascinating. I want to go back to that midrash, and I'm sorry if I'm midrash.
Midrash, yeah.
Midrash. I have a question queued up at some point. It's a lot later down the line about Jewish mysticism, and thinking about Judaism as a contemplative tradition. And I know that they might not be synonymous, but I had the experience of reading Ecclesiastes in a Bible study at some point in college, and I remember reading some of it thinking, we're going to think about this for 1 week. I could think about this for the rest of my life. And I think even today, as I was driving to work, I was like, oh, I don't mind. I thought of Ecclesiastes. I was like, I don't mind like a really cloudy day. I sort of like don't mind seasons, and I thought about that line like there's a season for everything, or at least the sentiment from that. Is midrash, is that interpretation or interpretive style, is that aligned with the contemplative style or the way that you understand that word, or the way at least I might understand that word?
Well, that word, again, that's another word that's kind of coming out of Christian tradition.
Okay.
But mysticism is a big, it's very hard to define what mysticism is, and there's different definitions of what mysticism is. So one definition is kind of cultivating a direct experience of God, as opposed to relying on the Bible for kind of indirect knowledge of God. Some mystics would be experts in cultivating a kind of very intense, direct, personal, experiential, sensory experience of God. So that's one way of thinking about mysticism, and you have that in Christianity. Christian mystics will have visions of God or visions of Jesus, and that's a kind of source of insight and knowledge that isn't coming from the Bible. It's coming from experience. It's coming from God revealing, or Jesus revealing himself directly to the mystics. So you have something like that in Judaism too, where there are different ways of cultivating a kind of direct experience of kind of a manifestation of God. But mysticism sometimes refers to interpretations of the Bible that kind of uncover a kind of secret level of meaning in the Bible. So, the most famous, the Hebrew word for mysticism is Kabbalah. And the kind of most famous text in Kabbalistic tradition is called the Zohar, which is spelled Zohar. And the Zohar is actually a commentary on the Torah. But it's a commentary that kind of reads it as a kind of code for understanding the true nature of God. It's kind of, you have to decipher it to understand what it's saying about God. So I think that might be close to what you mean.
Yeah, that was pretty good.
And that is very important, hugely important in Jewish tradition. And it kind of is an offshoot of Midrash. The author of the Zohar was kind of engaging in a mystical Midrashic interpretation of the Bible. So not all Midrash is mystical, but mystical interpretations usually express themselves through the techniques of Midrashic interpretation.
Given that definition of mysticism, would all the prophets have been mystics insofar as they purport to have a direct experience of or with God?
There's definitely continuity between biblical prophecy and mysticism. And, especially I don't know if you've read the book of Ezekiel, but, he has these very strange visions of God that those visions become very important in later mystical tradition. So there's a lot of continuity there. However, in Judaism, in Jewish tradition, prophecy ends with shortly after what's called the Babylonian exile in 586 BCE. And the last books in the Jewish Bible, which are the books of Haggai and Zechariah, these are people don't usually read these books, but they're the latest in terms of history of the books that were written. Those are from shortly after the Babylonian exile, and there was kind of a turning point in Jewish tradition at that point where God stops creating prophets and you start getting interpretation of the Torah. So in Jewish tradition, mystics, they get insights from God, but it's always kind of in relationship to the Torah, to the 5 books of Moses, and it's kind of a technique for understanding the 5 books of Moses. So you don't have prophets anymore that produce new biblical books that ended, and instead you get these mystics who get special insight into the meaning of the biblical books that were already revealed. Does that make sense?
It does. Interesting. Yeah. The Babylonian exile, please excuse my ignorance. Was the book of Psalms written during that time?
So, first of all, I'll throw out a date real quick. So the Babylonian exile happens in 586 BCE. Babylonians were this empire based in what is now Iraq, and they were a very aggressive empire, and they expanded into the region where the ancestors of the Jews lived, and conquered that territory, and eventually they destroyed the city of Jerusalem, and they destroyed the temple that Solomon had built there. And the answer to your question is going to depend on whether the person giving the answer is religious or secular.
Oh,
So a religious answer would be, well,
I define that as a good question.
That's a good question. So the traditional religious answer is that the book of Psalms were written by King David,
Okay.
who lived a long time before the Babylonian exile. And some talk about the exile, but that's according to a religious perspective, because David was a prophet, he could see into the future.
Mm.
From a secular scholarly perspective, the Psalms were written by different people at different times. Some were written before the exile, some were written after the exile, and probably none of them were written by King David, according to the secular perspective. So sorry for that two-part answer to your question.
No, I appreciate it. I think the way that I always understood the book of Psalms was that it was almost designed as a book of home prayer during the exile when you couldn't convene in temples. That might be a very CCD.
No, some of them were, but some of them were actually written for use in the temple. So some are from the time when the temple was still standing.
Yeah. And
they were used as they were sung in connection to sacrifice, or they were sung, Jews would make a pilgrimage to the temple, and they were sung in the context of a pilgrimage, or they were sung when people had committed some sin and they were trying to repent. So they were part of the kind of the temple ritual. And then others were written after the Babylonian exile, and are kind of close to what you were describing. Eventually, they rebuilt the temple. There was a second temple, but at that point, people were writing psalms that were not necessarily meant to be used in the temple.
Interesting. I have a question about the temple. I'm thinking about it specifically during the age of antiquity, where I might be interested in sort of Christian origins. What was if you can tell me if that is an area you're interested in or expert in, but what would, if you know, what was the role of the temple at that point, and was it very different from maybe the role of the temple before or after it?
So there was, we're talking about like the time of Jesus?
Yes.
Okay, so that's the second temple. So there are two temples. There's the first temple, which is the temple that was built by King Solomon and existed in Jerusalem throughout the period of the kings that descended from David and Solomon. And that temple was destroyed by the Babylonians during the Babylonian conquest that I was talking about a few minutes ago in 586 BCE. Then there's 70 years or so, and the Jews are taken into exile in Babylonia, and then the Babylonians are themselves conquered by another empire called the Persian Empire, led by a ruler named Cyrus the Great, and he allows the Jews to go back from Babylonia back to their homeland. We refer to that region as Judea, as it's known by the Greeks and Romans. And they go back there, and after a little while, they are allowed to rebuild a temple in Jerusalem, and that is what we call the Second Temple. So the Second Temple then stood for many hundreds of years, and then comes along the Roman Empire, which conquers Judea in 63 BCE. So we're talking 60 years before Jesus. The Romans conquer Judea, and they install a a kind of puppet king, one of whose descendants was a guy named Herod the Great. And Herod was a close ally of the Romans. He was, he knew Antony and Cleopatra, if you know those people from Roman history. And he was very powerful, very wealthy. And he used his wealth to kind of build up the Second Temple, make it much bigger and much more impressive and much more beautiful. And you start to have like more and more pilgrims coming to it, tens of thousands of pilgrims, maybe hundreds of thousands of pilgrims. And it becomes a kind of tourist attraction as well as, the sacred site. So that is a temple that would have existed in the time of Jesus. It would have been this like massive thing, bringing a lot of pilgrims during the major Jewish festivals, Passover and the other festivals. And the priests who served in the temple, especially the head priest, were very powerful figures. And so that's the temple that Jesus, that existed in Jesus' day. And then, Jesus dies around 30 CE. And Paul, writes his letters, and the temple is still standing when Paul's writing his letter. So Paul would have known that temple too. And then what happens is in 66 CE, there was a big Jewish rebellion against the Romans. It's called the Jewish Revolt or the Great Revolt, and it was a massive revolt, and it lasted for 4 years. And finally, the Romans defeated the Jews, and they conquered Jerusalem, and they destroyed the Second Temple. So, in secular scholarship about the New Testament, about the Gospels, Paul's letters, the ones that are written by Paul, they come from the time when the temple is still standing. But there's a debate among scholars about whether the Gospels are written before or after the destruction of the Second Temple. And most scholars, I think, would place them after the destruction of the Second Temple, but there's scholars who also put them, or at least some of them, before the destruction of the Second Temple. So that's a real turning point for Judaism too, because of course the Jews never rebuilt the temple. There's not been another temple, and so after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70, the leaders who emerge are this group of people I've been calling the rabbis, who are scholars, and they helped the community adapt to a religious life that was not dependent on the temple anymore. And so in the following centuries, you have the emergence of what we call Rabbinic Judaism, which is Judaism that is centered not in the temple anymore, but in the synagogue, and is not centered around the act of sacrifice in the temple anymore, but is centered around the study of the Torah, and is not centered around the priest anymore, but is centered around the rabbi. The rabbi is a teacher. So that is a major shift. In Judaism today, for 95% plus of Jews, is this rabbinic kind of Judaism, where the central authority is the rabbi, and there's no temple, there's no sacrifice, and where the central kind of way of interacting with God is through the interpretation of the Torah.
Is it through the interpretation of the Torah, through way of the rabbi?
Yes. Well, yes. So I have to take a moment to explain a little bit more about what Torah means for for Jews.
Please. That was a great answer, by the way. Thank you very much for that.
Oh, sure. And I can get carried away, so you just have to cut me off if I go on.
No, by design.
So, I said that Torah is a Hebrew word. It originally means teaching or instruction, or sometimes people understand it to mean law, but it really is closer to meaning teaching. And for Jews, there's kind of two sides to Torah. And one side Christians kind of know about, and the other side Christians don't know so much about. So the side they know about is the 5 books of Moses. And for Jews, that is what they call the written Torah. That was a Torah, a revelation from God, revealed to Moses, that was written down in these 5 books. And if you were to go to a synagogue on a Saturday, which is the Sabbath for Jews, you'd see Jews reading from those 5 books. So that is, part of the Torah. But for Jews as well, God revealed something else to Moses that they refer to as the oral Torah. And the oral Torah is an oral tradition. So it wasn't written down by Moses. It was revealed by God orally to Moses, and God passed it on to Joshua orally, and Joshua passed it down orally to other prophets, and those prophets passed it down, and eventually reached the rabbis. And it's originally an oral tradition, but when the rabbis got it, a lot of oral traditions, they expand over time. People add to them. And I mean, this is going to be like a strange idea, but the rabbis believed that even though this Torah was expanding and teachers were adding to it, it was all what God intended to begin with. So it was still part of the Torah that God revealed to Moses, but it changed and grew over time, like a lot of oral traditions do. And by the time it reaches the rabbis, after the destruction of the Second Temple, it's so massive and there's so much to it, and it's so unwieldy that they feel like they need to organize it and eventually write it down. And the first thing that they write down is called the Mishnah, which is really a kind of organizing of the oral Torah that existed at around 200 CE or AD. And then the rabbis, they kept teaching the Mishnah and they commented on it, and the oral tradition kept developing in that way. And eventually they kind of organized it again as a kind of commentary on the Mishnah called the Talmud. And so the Mishnah and the Talmud are the oral Torah. They are part of the Torah for Jews. The 5 books of Moses is part of the Torah, the written Torah. There's also the oral Torah that is founded on the Mishnah and the Talmud. So when Jews think about what God revealed at Mount Sinai to Moses, they're not just thinking about the 5 books of Moses. They're also thinking about this oral tradition, this oral Torah. And, if you want to understand Judaism, you have to understand the oral Torah. It's not enough to read the 5 books of Moses. You have to study the Talmud, which is not an easy text to study. So that's why, I had to unpack what Torah means for Jews because there's a lot going on there.
Yeah. No, that's awesome.
Now, interestingly, Christians, also believe that Revelation has 2 sides to it, right? There's the Old Testament and the New Testament. And, the Old Testament is revealed in one historical period, and the New Testament is revealed in a different historical period. So both Judaism and Christianity have the idea that the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament, was not the end of the story, just the beginning of the story.
Sure.
And Jews believe that too.
You had another awesome answer. You had this great, very clear bit where you described the difference between sort of, for lack of Judaism in the temple versus Rabbidic Jews. Is it Rabbidic or Ribbit? How am I saying that word?
Rabbinic.
Rabbinic.
That's Rabbinic.
Rabbinic. Thank you.
And rabbi, by the way, means my teacher.
Teacher.
And Jesus' disciples called him rabbi.
Yeah.
So because he was their rabbi, he was their teacher.
So that you describe Judaism in the temple as sort of being centered around sacrifices in the temple, and I forget what the last part was, and then that sort of shifts to Rabbinic Judaism. Do you think, looking back, as a scholar that there would have necessarily been a shift in the way that they practice. And I think about what sacrifices in the temple might have looked like. Um, and I imagine, again, this is, I'm not qualified to imagine with any authority, but I imagine that would be more experiential, where the shift towards rabbinic Judaism seems more pedantic or almost academic. Is that is that way too simple?
Um, well, you're right that the sacrifice was like a very intense experience, but it was only most Israelites wouldn't have experienced it. It was the sacrifices were offered by priests, kind of professionals in the temple. You know, a pilgrim would come with a sacrifice to the temple, but in most cases they'd hand the sacrifice over to the priest, who would go inside the temple, and an ordinary Israelite would not be allowed in the temple, and the priest would sacrifice the animal inside the temple. So it was a very, actually kind of an elitist experience that an ordinary Israelite or Jew would not have, experienced directly. With the rabbis, so rabbis, now with the rabbis, the way you relate to God is through interpretation of the Torah, and so anybody who knows how to read can have access to that kind of experience. Now, not everybody knew how to read, that's true, but more people knew how to read than were able to offer a sacrifice in the temple. And so it kind of opened it up a lot. And then Christianity went all the way with it and, spread this interest in the Bible beyond the Jewish community. Paul brought it to the whole world as he knew it, the Roman Empire. And so Christianity really had a maximalist vision of inclusivity in terms of who gets to participate in this experience, who gets to have a relationship with God. Jews were very. It's like ancestry was very important for Jews. You had to come from a certain ancestry. You had to have certain parents, and God's relationship was based on a people that was really basically like a big family. We were all kind of biologically connected to each other. That's not the situation, it is somewhat the situation today, but now you have converts to Judaism as well. But Christianity really said, no, it's not based on genealogy, it's not based on ancestry, it's based on, believing in God, in Jesus, and believing in God. And so it doesn't matter whether you're Jew or non-Jew or a free person or a slave, or it doesn't matter what your background. So that's a big change in Christianity and Jews. But the rabbis also expanded it by saying, look, this is available to any Jew who learns how to study the text and read it. And also the rabbis also very much stress prayer. So Rabbinic Judaism, if you're an observant Jew, you're supposed to pray 3 times a day. That's a direct, that's talking to God essentially. Not necessarily that God is talking back, but you're talking to God. And so there's a lot of kind of experientiality in Rabbinic Judaism too.
Interesting. I spoke earlier this year with Dr. Elaine Pagels at Princeton. She wrote a lot about the Gnostic Gospels, or at least that was the part that really interested me.
Yeah, and she's a giant, by the way, in that field.
Yeah, she was extremely generous, as you can now relate to sitting through this.
No, it's fun.
Glad you think so. So she made this really interesting distinction where she was talking about the sort of Gnostic texts, or we were really zooming in on the Gospel of Thomas. And she sort of made this interesting distinction between the public teachings versus these esoteric teachings. And she said, and I again, I don't have any authority to confirm this, but that rabbis at the time would have had more public teachings and more esoteric teachings, or esoteric might not be the right word, but sort of private teachings, and your the sort of 5 books of Moses and the oral Torah that was passed from Moses to Joshua all the way to the rabbis, um, sort of reminded me of that. Uh, would that at one point have been sort of private, or was it the rabbi's job to have brought that to the public?
So that's a very nice insight. So I think, originally it was kind of like that, where the 5 books of Moses was, first of all, by the time the rabbis lived, the 5 books of Moses had been translated into Greek. There were Christians. The rabbis knew that other people out there beyond the Jews were reading this text and finding it interesting. So they would have thought of that as more public. And the oral Torah, which was written in Hebrew and Aramaic, and you can't just pick it up and understand it, that would have, and in fact, they do explicitly describe it as, what you call a kind of esoteric tradition. So I think that does apply to at least how some of the ancient rabbis understood it. Now, I have to throw in another little footnote here, which is there's another thing about the rabbis that makes it very hard to generalize about them, and that is they were like academics today. Academics today love to debate, and they love to kind of try to prove each other wrong. And that's how these ancient rabbis were like too. So they love to argue with each other. They had different points of view. They would interpret a verse in different ways, opposite ways, and they would get on arguments. And what's interesting about Rabbinic Judaism is at a certain point, they said, you know what? It's all valuable. It's not so important to figure out, is this rabbi right or that rabbi wrong? There's some wisdom to learn from both sides of the debate, so let's preserve it all. And so, on some issues you have to decide one way or the other, but in a lot of areas they just preserve multiple points of view that kind of reflect a big debate about how to interpret different verses. So, some rabbis thought X, but other rabbis thought Y. And so it's hard to generalize about what they believe for that reason. They did share certain beliefs in common, but there's a lot of disagreement too. So that esoteric public distinction does work to some degree for the rabbis, but not completely so. And then things do change in a later period, and most Jews today don't have any idea what's in the Talmud. American Jews kind of lost a lot of that. Orthodox Jews, that's still important, but what we call Reform Jews or conservative Jews, a lot of Jews are not familiar with that. They don't have a chance to study it. They'll know what the word Talmud means maybe, but they won't really have had a chance to study it. So there's been a lot of changes in Judaism over the centuries.
And what was you mentioned this earlier, and you may have answered this question, but is there a relationship between the Talmud and the Kabbalah?
Not really. So the Talmud refers to it's kind of a part of that oral Torah.
And I thought the oral Torah was a commentary.
There's 2 parts of the oral Torah. There's the Mishnah, which is the earliest document, and then the Talmud is kind of a commentary on the Mishnah.
Okay, I understand.
And the Kabbalah and the Zohar, the Kabbalah is just a word for Jewish mysticism, so it's not a specific text. But the Zohar is a commentary on the 5 books of Moses.
Okay,
but it's influenced by the Talmud. So it gets a little murky pretty quickly. But.
No, that cleared it up for me. I spoke with someone who's an Old Testament scholar in a PhD program currently, who also teaches at the same school I teach at, and he, I was asking him about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'd be really interested to ask you, and I don't know if we have enough time for me to go through all the setup questions. What are the Dead Sea Scrolls? But you might need to back up and do this for me. But is there a connection between the communities that might have been called Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls? Because he told me that he had an instinct that they did, but told me that he would be fiercely debated on that topic. So I'd be interested to hear you weigh in.
Yeah, are you okay with another footnote?
Totally, totally.
A little background there. So, before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, so the Dead Sea Scrolls were kind of discovered in 1947, and it took a couple years to kind of study them, and so they became known over the course of the 1950s, and took a long time to publish all of them. But before that discovery, a lot of what we knew about ancient Judaism in the centuries before Jesus and in the time of Jesus came from a historian named Josephus, who was a Jew who participated in that Jewish revolt that I mentioned, but at a critical moment kind of switched side to the Romans and moved to Rome and wrote a history of the Jews. And also wrote an account of that Jewish revolt. And he was our main source of information about what Jews believed in that time period. And he describes several different, what he calls several kind of Jewish philosophies. They're really kind of different groups that had different ideas about God and about what the Bible meant and stuff. And they include, the three main ones were the Pharisees, who we also knew about from the New Testament, the Sadducees, who we also knew about from the New Testament, and then the Essenes. And I don't have time to get into all the differences between these three different groups, but the Essenes were, had their own distinctive beliefs. They shared property. They didn't believe in private property. They kind of shared common ownership. They lived off on their own. A lot of them, some of them had families, but a lot of them practiced abstention. They didn't have families or have sex, and they're just a very interesting kind of sect. And so when scholars discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls and they began to decipher them, they discovered that a lot of the scrolls were from a particular community that probably lived in the Judean wilderness, not far from the Dead Sea, and had a lot of similarities with the Essenes. And so there arose this hypothesis that the Dead Sea Scroll community was an Essene community. But it's a theory, because it's not like the community the Dead Sea Scrolls never say, oh, we're the Essenes. It doesn't use that language for themselves. So there are other scholars who think, no, this is like an offshoot of the Sadducees, or this is some other group that Josephus doesn't mention. And so there's a lot of debate about it. But I would say the most persuasive hypothesis is the Essene connection. There's a lot of correspondence between how Josephus describes the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scroll community.
Interesting. I know we're right at time, so I'm not sure exactly how to punctuate what question would be best for that. I have a little bit of interest in a Christian theologian or scholar. I'm not sure how to categorize him, named Rennie Gerard. I don't know if you're familiar at all with him. He has a particular interest in scapegoats as sort of like an anthropological mechanism to deliver us.
Oh, Rennie Gerard?
Yes, yeah. You are familiar?
I am familiar with him, yeah.
I guess I'd be interested. I know this is a strange way to end, but maybe in just a minute or two. Can you comment at all about his overlaying theory that the Bible, he thinks both parts, but you can speak to whichever one you want or both, is sort of a break from a mythic tradition that sided with the victimizer, where the biblical tradition sides with the victim?
Yeah, so Gerard, I mean, that's a tough one to answer in 2 minutes because Gerard has developed a theory of religion. In fact, a theory of how human beings work that would take some time to explain. And then he applies it to religion. And I am not the best person to represent him because I don't agree. I don't accept any of it. I don't believe it.
Really?
I've written an article kind of
Oh, cool.
criticizing him.
What's the name of the article?
I will send you, if you remind me, I will send you a link to
Cool.
the article. Because for him, the kind of key thing about human beings is he uses the language, what he calls mimesis.
Yeah.
Which is related to our word for meme, like an internet meme. So like with an internet meme, what is a meme? A meme is kind of like something that copies itself over and over again. So mimesis is kind of from the Greek to copy. And he believes that human beings are very imitative of one another. And, I'll be born and I'll see you do something that gets you something. I'll see you, I don't know, playing basketball and making a lot of money. And so I want the money too. So I'll copy you and try to play basketball too. And then we become rivals and there's kind of a competition. And he kind of sees that dynamic of imitation and rivalry as kind of the source of religion. And ultimately what happens is if you have like two rivals and they're like trying to destroy each other, they're going to mutually destroy each other. It's not going to end well.
Sure.
And so these religious communities came up with sacrifice, kind of killing, instead of like killing each other, they like deflected it onto an animal. If that makes sense.
Or a person.
Kind of and then of course Jesus is understood as kind of, so the sacrifice is kind of a solution to this mimetic competition that he imagines happening. And, instead of spiraling in endless violence, communities said, well, we're going to like project the violence onto this animal and that will resolve the conflict. And doesn't really resolve the conflict, but that's kind of what happens. And so eventually they take that idea and apply it to the sacrifice that Jesus made when he was crucified. And Gerard, I'm not doing a great job explaining the theory, but
I agree.
Gerard sees, the crucifixion as kind of a solution to this mimetic competition that is so destructive. So I do agree that human beings are very imitative. And I do agree that there's a kind of interesting relationship between competition and imitation. But I think he just way pushes that theory too much. But he has some pretty, devoted followers. So.
Do you think there's a relationship between? I know it's difficult to draw a line all the way through the Hebrew Bible, but do you think there's a Jewish interest in scapegoats? I know one of his main citations in the Old Testament is he cites Leviticus, where I think we actually get the word scapegoat.
Right. So the idea of the scapegoat is related to the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement. And so the community, this is from the Hebrew Bible, the Israelite community believed there was one day of the year where they were supposed to cleanse the temple. Like sin was almost like a physical force, almost like radiation or something, and it kind of contaminated. Whenever somebody sinned, it would pollute the temple a little bit, and it would kind of build up over the course of the year. And if you didn't have a ritual to kind of cleanse the temple of all the sin that had contaminated it and all the kind of impurity that got into the temple, it would become impossible for God to reside there anymore. So they had a special day every year called Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, where the priests would go in and perform certain rituals to basically cleanse the temple of sin. And one of those rituals was taking the communal sins and putting it on a special goat that was sent off into the wilderness. And that's the scapegoat. That's the original scapegoat. So, but now then later on in our time, we use the language of scapegoat to, somebody, when you put the blame on somebody who's innocent, that's what we mean by scapegoating today. But it comes from this ritual in the book of Leviticus that's connected to the Yom Kippur. So that's where the language of scapegoat comes from. And, it's an interesting concept. And Christians applied it to Jesus, saw him as a scapegoat in the original biblical sense, a sacrifice that was taking the sin off of people, kind of deflecting it away from people so they would have a chance to, not be killed and survive and have an afterlife. So it has a really important and interesting history, but I wouldn't base the whole theory of religion on it.
Sure. Awesome. Well, I appreciate your time. I guess I'm going to start with your article about Gerard, but I would be remiss not to ask you if you could point me in any other direction, somebody I might want to talk to or something I might want to read. I reached out to Bart Ehrman with no luck, but I have been reading some of his stuff. But I'd be really interested in maybe what you would recommend.
Yeah, first of all, you have great questions, and they cover a lot of different grounds. So there are probably different people to talk to depending on which subcategory of question you want to pursue.
Is there one you think I should have focused on? Maybe that I might have not known enough to ask the obvious follow-up question and just moved on.
No, I wouldn't say that. I would say that every question you ask, though, could lead to a whole semester worth of fun.
Cool.
So it's really, let me say this. Why don't you think about what you're most interested in? Email me, and then I could probably give you, like, if you're interested in mysticism, I would send you one way. If you wanted to know more about the New Testament, I would send you in a different way.
Cool.
So it kind of just depends on what you're.
Yeah, I think that the question of mysticism in any tradition fascinates me right now, and I think that there's something about that Essene community. I love this question. I don't know if I would ask a relative stranger this question, but I love asking some of my friends who might be interested in religion. Do you think Jesus was a really good Jew or a really bad Jew? And I love the idea that Essene community, I don't know, troubles maybe my answer to that question. So I'm having.
For the record, I'll say Jesus was a good Jew.
Yeah.
I will say that. And he was not a Christian. He could not have been a Christian, right?
Right.
Christians only exist after him. So.
And I love Bart Ehrman's work on sort of how Jesus became a god, and how he, there's all sorts of debates about the Son of Man, Son of God question. I should have asked you about that, but he makes it really clear. Sorry, Ehrman makes it really clear that he would have never called himself God. He might have said Son of God, which I'd love to know what you think that means, but.
Yeah, I think that phrase has changed its meaning over time.
Yeah.
But I think it's from what I'm hearing, you might enjoy talking to a scholar of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So there's a scholar at NYU, for example, named Alex Jason, who I don't know very well, but he's certainly an expert in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I think he's at NYU, he's in the Religious Studies department. The last name is something like Jassen. He might be a good person to talk to. There's another scholar at Harvard named Annette Reed, who's an expert in how Judaism and Christianity related to each other in those early centuries, and challenges the way a lot of people think about their relationship. And she's a very prominent scholar in the field. Don't mention my name there. She doesn't like me all that much, but
she doesn't.
Well, that's a long story.
She might like
But
that
just all,
you recommended her.
um, um,
Well, that'll be my first question to her.
if you want to, yeah. But there's, but she's a brilliant scholar, no doubt. And I mean, there's just a whole lot of scholars, and I think something you would enjoy now that I know the depth of your interest is there's something called the Society of Biblical Literature, which is kind of the major academic society for the study of both the Old Testament and the New Testament. The academic study of it, the kind of secular academic study of it, although there are a lot of religious scholars who attend. And they have annual meetings, and they move from one city to the next, and but eventually they'll get to Philadelphia, or maybe they'll be in Boston or someplace you can get to. And you might just enjoy. Those are usually like 3-day conferences. You might just sign up and go to these sessions, and you'll get more than enough insight from the different scholars that way.
I'll never ask another question again.
That'll probably kill any interest you have in the because there's a lot of scholarship out there. I mean, there are literally thousands of scholars who do this kind of work, and there's so many different directions. So.
Awesome, Steve. You've been super generous with your time. Thank you so much, and I'll reach out about that article. Fascinated to read it.
Yeah, your curiosity is great. So you hang on to that. That's a wonderful trait.
Thank you very much. All right, thank you again, and I hope to be in touch soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.